First You Think is a not-for-profit ministry of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. Support us at ucdsm.org today.
Today, I want to talk about something that's not often discussed in theology. Play. Not recreation, not entertainment, not simply something children do while adults are busy with real life. I want to talk about play as a spiritual practice, play as a way of encountering the sacred, play as something that forms our souls just as surely as prayer, service, or meditation. And I have to admit, this topic feels deeply personal, because I have always had a playful side, and some people might describe me as silly, some might say I never quite grew up, and some might wonder why I still get excited about things that are often considered childish or insignificant. I am what people lovingly and sometimes teasingly call a Disney adult. Yes, I am one of those people. The kind of person who hears the opening notes of a Disney song and immediately knows the movie. The kind that's this person who thinks mouse ears are more appropriate attire for more occasions than society currently allows. And I'm the kind of person who believes there is absolutely nothing wrong with standing in line for an hour to hug a fictional character. And I know there are people who hear the phrase Disney adult and immediately think, oh no. But I have come to believe that there is something beautiful about allowing yourself something wholeheartedly. There's something courageous about refusing to become cynical. There's something sacred about protecting your capacity for joy. And apparently, though, my capacity for wonder extends beyond animated creatures. Because when I was 23 years old, which is not far off from now, I met Chewbacca. Yes, Chewbacca, a 7-foot-tall Wookiee from Star Wars. And I cried. Actually cried. Like, not a little emotional moment, full-on cried at 23 years old. And I was a fully grown adult standing in front of someone wearing an incredibly convincing Wookiee costume, with tears streaming down my face. Now, I know what some people hear when I tell that story. They may hear an adult cried over a fictional character. And maybe that sounds ridiculous. Maybe it is ridiculous. But I've realized something. What fascinated me afterwards wasn't that I cried. It was how quickly people assumed I should be embarrassed. Nobody would have questioned tears at a wedding. Nobody would have questioned tears after graduating. Nobody would have questioned tears after receiving an award or getting a promotion. Those are respectable emotions. But tears because you experienced wonder. Because you connected with a story that shaped your childhood. Because for one brief moment, the world felt magical again. Suddenly, people start asking, aren't you a little old for that? And that question has stayed with me. Not because I felt embarrassed, but because I began wondering, when did we learn that joy had an expiration date? Who decided that adulthood means replacing wonder with practicality? Who taught us that imagination belongs to children when productivity belongs to adults? Because children are never ashamed of their delight. A child meeting Chewbacca doesn't apologize. A child doesn't stop to think, will this make people think I'm immature? A child just simply experiences joy. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, something changes. We begin believing that growing up means becoming more serious. That responsible people don't get overly excited. That mature people don't play. That successful people don't waste time. And maybe that's one of the greatest losses of adulthood. Not that we grow older, but that we simply become suspicious of joy. And before I go any further, I want to acknowledge something that happened here last week. Last week's service was in many ways an experiment in holy play. Rather than following our usual structure, we created worship together through improvisation. We stepped into uncertainty. We listened. We responded. We trusted one another. And we created something that had never existed before. There were no guarantees, no script telling us exactly what would happen, and no certainty that everything would work perfectly. which, if you think about it, sounds an awful like children creating together. Children don't wait until they have a perfect plan before they begin. They just begin. And they discover, they build, they knock it down, they laugh, they start over. Adults often call that inefficient. Children call it Tuesday. Last week, we gave ourselves permission to do something adults rarely allow themselves to do. We looked a little foolish. We let go of perfection. We made room for surprise. We created creativity more than control. And what emerged wasn't chaos. It was community. That is the power of play. Improvisation, after all, isn't the absence of discipline. It's the presence of trust. Trust that you do not need every answer before you begin. Trust that you can respond instead of control. Trust that something meaningful can emerge when people listen deeply to one another. And trust that feels deeply spiritual to me. And perhaps it feels especially Unitarian Universalist, because ours is a tradition that does not claim one person possesses all the truth. We gather with different stories, different questions, different experiences, different wisdom. Then together we create something richer than any of us could have created alone. That is exactly what improvisation does. And perhaps that is exactly what this faith does. Science, interestingly enough, has begun confirming what spiritual traditions have understood for centuries. Play is not luxury. It is not reward for finishing our work. It is not something we graduate beyond. Play is essential to being human. Psychiatrist Stuart Brown, who founded the National Institute for Play, has spent decades studying what happens when play disappears from our lives. His conclusion is remarkably simple. Play helps us become more fully human. It strengthens creativity. It develops resilience. It improves our emotional regulation. It deepens our relationships. It increases our capacity to solve problems, and it even helps our brains recover from chronic stress. In other words, play isn't the opposite of work. Play is one of the things that makes good work and good lives possible. Yet, isn't it strange how adults teaches exactly the opposite? We speak about play as though it may always be ended. I'm sure we all have told ourselves, I'll relax when everything is finished, or I'll enjoy myself after I catch up, or I'll take time for fun once I become less busy. But have you noticed? Everything is never finished. The inbox refills, the laundry returns, the dishes multiply, the calendar somehow becomes even fuller, and there is always one more email, one more errand, one more responsibility, and so we postpone joy. Sometimes for years. I wonder if part of the problem is that somewhere along the way we begin measuring ourselves by what we produce. Children don't do that. Have you ever watched a child build a blanket fort? They don't stop halfway through and ask, will this increase my efficiency? Will this improve my resume? Or will this advance my 5-year plan? No, they simply create. Because creating is enough. They don't draw pictures because someone might buy them. They don't sing because they think they'll become famous. They don't dance because they're trying to burn calories. They dance because music just happened. And somewhere along the way, we lose that. We begin introducing ourselves by our jobs. We ask strangers, what do you do? Not what brings you joy. Not what makes you come alive. Not what fills you with wonder. What do you do? Our identity slowly becomes wrapped in our usefulness. Our value becomes tangled with our productivity. We begin believing that every moment must accomplish something. Reading becomes acceptable if it's educational. Exercise becomes acceptable if it improves performance. Hobbies become acceptable if they become side businesses. Even rest has to become productive. We optimize our sleep. We maximize our vacations. We monetize our creativity. Somehow, we have become uncomfortable simply enjoying something because it's beautiful. Joy has to justify itself. Wonder has to defend itself. Play has to earn permission to exist. And maybe that is why meeting Chewbacca moved me so deeply. Because for those few moments, I wasn't accomplishing anything. I wasn't improving myself. I wasn't networking. I wasn't checking off a goal. I wasn't becoming more productive. I was simply experiencing joy. And perhaps that is precisely why it felt holy. Not because Chewbacca is sacred, but because wonder is. Because being fully present is. Because remembering that life is meant to be something experienced but not merely managed is. The more I think about it, the more I wonder if this obsession with productivity has quietly become one of the defining spiritual struggles of our age. We rarely ask whether we are becoming wiser. We ask whether we are becoming more efficient. We rarely ask whether our souls are healthy. We ask whether our schedules are full. We rarely ask whether we are deeply alive. We ask whether we are getting enough done. And our culture has become remarkably good at helping us produce. It is far less interested in helping us flourish. And that is where faith has something important to say. Because every week, whether we realize it or not, we gather here to practice a different story. We live in a culture that says your value comes from what you accomplish. Our faith says your worth is inherent. Our culture says, what have you produced? And our faith says, who are you becoming? Our culture tells us to earn our place, but our faith reminds us that every single person already possesses inherent worth and dignity. Not because of what they do, not because of what they contribute, not because of how successful they become, simply because they exist. That is a radically different way of seeing the world. And if that is true, then perhaps play is not a distraction from our spiritual lives. Perhaps it is one of the ways we remember who we have been all along. So perhaps play is not a distraction, but a way that it can remind us of something our faith teaches us again and again. We are not human beings who occasionally have moments of wonder. We are human beings made for wonder. One of the most important parts of play is imagination. And imagination is something adults often underestimate. We tend to think imagination is something children use because they do not yet understand the real world. Children imagine dragons, they imagine kingdoms, they imagine that a cardboard box can become a spaceship. And adults, meanwhile, pride ourselves on being realistic. We learn to focus on what is practical, what is measurable, what is possible, and that there's wisdom in predictability. We need responsibility, we need knowledge, we need the ability to navigate the world as it is. But what happens when practicality becomes the only lens through which we see? What happens when we become so focused on what is that we lose our ability to imagine what could be? Because every human achievement began as something someone imagined before it existed. Every work of art, every scientific discovery, every movement for justice, every act of compassion, every moment of transformation, someone had to look at the world as it was and imagine the world as it could become. That is what imagination does. It opens a door between reality and possibility, and that is deeply connected to faith. Faith begins with the question, what if? What if there was more love than we currently see? What if people are capable of change? What if our communities can become more compassionate? What if justice is possible? What if the world we inherited is not the world we have to leave behind? Every one of those questions requires imagination. You cannot move toward a more just world if you cannot imagine justice. You cannot build beloved community if you cannot imagine relationships rooted in greater compassion. You cannot search for truth and meaning if you cannot imagine that there is still more truth and meaning waiting to be discovered. Imagination is not childish. Imagination is one of the most powerful spiritual practices we can have. And perhaps that is why play is so connected to spiritual growth. We often imagine spiritual maturity as moving from uncertainty towards certainty, as though becoming a person of faith means eventually having all the answers. But I wonder if the opposite is actually true. Perhaps spiritual maturity is not becoming someone who has fewer questions. Perhaps spiritual maturity is becoming someone who can live more gracefully with mystery. Play teaches us how to do that. When we play, we experiment. We try something, we fail, we laugh, we adjust, and we try again. We learn that mistakes are not the end of the story. They are part of the story. And doesn't that sound a lot like spiritual play? Faith is not about building a perfect life. It is about remaining open. It is about continuing to grow, continuing to learn, continuing to be transformed. Faith is less like constructing a flawless building and more like building with blocks. We create something, it falls apart, we rebuild, we try a different approach. Maybe we make it taller, maybe we make it stranger, maybe we add a dragon. And honestly, the version with the dragon is usually more interesting. And this is why I think last week's improvisational service mattered so much to me. We didn't simply try something different. We practiced a spiritual discipline. We practiced openness. We practiced trust. We practiced creativity. And we practiced letting go of the idea that something meaningful only happens when everything is perfectly planned. And that is a lesson many adults desperately need. Because we live in a world that tells us uncertainty is something to eliminate. We want the 5-year plan, the retirement plan, the backup plan, the plan for when the plan doesn't work, and we want guarantees. We want control, but life rarely offers guarantees. Faith asks us to step forward anyways, and play teaches us how. When children play, they do not need to know how exactly the story is going to end. They enter the story. They participate, they create, they discover, and maybe that is what we are called to do in our spiritual lives. Not to wait until everything makes sense before we begin living, but to enter the mystery, to participate in confusion, to be part of the creation, and to trust that everything sacred can emerge when we show up with our open hearts. I keep returning to that moment with Chewbacca, because the older I get, the more I realize that moment was never really about Star Wars. It wasn't really about a costume. It wasn't really about a character. It was about connection. It was about memory. It was about stories that had shaped me. It was about a little piece of my childhood that somehow survived into adulthood. And maybe that's part of the gift of play. Play reconnects us with the parts of ourselves we thought we had outgrown. That curious part, that creative part, the part that notices our beauty, the part that gets excited, the part that believes something ordinary can become extraordinary, the part that still looks at the world and wonders. There is a difference between being childish and being childlike. Childishness can mean refusing to grow. It can mean avoiding responsibility. It can mean being unwilling to learn. But childlikeness is something entirely different. Childlikeness is openness, curiosity, wonder, trust, the willingness to ask questions, and the willingness to imagine possibilities. This willingness to see something familiar and still discover something new. So perhaps the question before us is not simply, do we play enough? Perhaps the deeper question is, what have we lost by refusing to play? Where have we become too serious? Where have we decided that wonder is no longer appropriate? And where have we convinced ourselves that joy must be earned? Where have we traded our curiosity for certainty? And where have we exchanged imagination for our efficiency? Because this world does not need adults who have forgotten how to wonder. The world needs people who can imagine, people who can create, people who can laugh, people who can look at what exists and say, maybe there's another way. People who have seen suffering and still believe healing is possible. People who can see division and still imagine connection. People who can see injustice and still imagine liberation. People who can see a broken world and still believe something beautiful can be built. This is not childish. This is spiritual. So this week, I invite you all to play. Not because you have finished everything. Not because all your responsibilities have disappeared. Not because you have finally earned permission. Play because you are human. Make something that does not need to be useful. Draw something badly. Write something silly, sing loudly, dance like everyone is watching. And Spend time doing something simply because it brings you joy. Allow yourself to wonder, allow yourself to imagine, and allow yourself to experience delight without apologizing for it. And if a small voice inside you says, "That is ridiculous," perhaps listen closely. Maybe that voice is not wisdom. Maybe it is simply part of adulthood that learned to be afraid of joy. Because perhaps the people who still get emotional meeting Chewbacca are not the ones who have failed to grow up. Perhaps they are the ones who have refused to let adulthood steal their sense of wonder. Perhaps they're the ones who remember that joy does not have an expiration date. Perhaps they are the ones who remember that this life is not only about managing responsibilities, checking boxes, and getting things done. It is also about being moved. It is about delight. It's about connection. It is about allowing ourselves to stand in awe of something larger than ourselves, even if occasionally that something happens to be a 7-foot-tall Wookiee. I think about that 23-year-old version of myself standing in front of Chewbacca. A little embarrassed, a little overwhelmed, completely filled with joy. And now, years later, I don't think that person needed to grow up. I think that person remembered something important, something adulthood had tried to convince me to forget. That joy is not a weakness. That wonder is not immaturity. That imagination is not escape from reality. Sometimes, imagination gives us the courage to change our reality. Sometimes laughter is sacred. Sometimes silliness is holy. And sometimes that path towards deeper faith is not found by becoming more serious. Sometimes it's found by learning to play again. May we protect our joy. May we nurture our imagination. May we trust our curiosity, and may we continue searching for truth and meaning with our open hearts. May we remember that every person has inherent worth and dignity, not because of what they produce, but because they are. And may we never become so busy proving that we are adults that we forget how to be alive. Thank you.